You are now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast with Bryan Most and Don Davis.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bryan Most, SVP of Retail Strategy at NYSHEX and former VP of Supply Chain at Walmart.
And I'm Don Davis. I'm the Senior Vice President of Carrier Strategy here at NYSHEX and former executive of Hapag-Lloyd and CMA CGM.
And we're back again with our podcast, Supply Chain Secrets. First of all, to all the listeners out there, thanks again for the feedback and support of the show. It's really been great to hear what's on your minds and what you'd like us to discuss in upcoming podcasts. It's clear from the feedback that you like hearing directly from our NYSHEX members and them telling their stories about adapting and evolving to overcome the disruptions in the supply chain, and we'll certainly work to bring you more of those stories in the future. However, today, we've been asked to take a moment to reassess the current marketplace and what impacts that may have on the next contracting cycle. Now, Don and I have talked a little bit about this subject in the past, but things are changing so quickly. I think many people are just trying to figure out what's next and how to approach the next budgeting cycle. So, Don, we've said before it's dangerous to try and predict the future, but it seems like that's what everybody's trying to do right now. So, you want to get started?
Yeah, sure. And I think that, I'm no Nostradamus, although I guess you could debate how effective he was, but no predictor of future events. But I think the first place to really start is like, what is the current market outlook? And I think the reality is not much has changed in terms of market outlook. You still see that space and equipment are tight. You still see that there are port disruptions in different places. We aren't currently experiencing a port shutdown in China, so we seem to be past that. But, congestion is starting again on the West Coast, which is, of course, causing vessels to be blanked. So it doesn't really seem that in the short term that there's any change. And most people I talk to speculate that this is going to continue well into next year. And I think one of the big concerns as you look at a very tight market heading into second quarter of next year is that there's, of course, the risk of this labor negotiation and that this is something that could drag on, cause ports and terminals to work more slowly. So from a future outlook perspective, I don't think there's any real good news, or it doesn't appear that things are going to change quickly in the short term.
You're right, Don. You said quite a bit there. I mean, maybe we unpack a little bit of it as well. And, from a shipper standpoint, there's no doubt that the things you just discussed are having a major impact on their solutions and how proactive they're being when it comes to trying to solve them. Just recently, we've seen some of the large BCOs announce that they've got involved in chartering ships and purchasing equipment and even some terminal and infrastructure investments that some have made because of the enormous expense, right, and disruption that's out there right now. And I don't think you have to go much further than looking at the quarterly earnings transcripts of some of the top importers to see that it's millions of dollars. And added expense, lost sales, disappointing customers, they justify these unconventional types of solutions. Typically retailers are happy to just invest capital in stores and things that are going to drive sales. But with the disruption, and as you said, it being probably out there for years to come, some of these investments might make sense.
Yeah, and I think IKEA was the last company we saw that had their own charter, and I think that's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, for shippers to actually be chartering ships and buying containers, I think it's an indication of the types of problems out there, and that shippers really need to solidify their supply chain. And I mean, what's your perspective on this? Do you think we've seen this chartering by BCOs? Is that going to cap now, or do you think that's something you'll still see in the next couple quarters?
Yeah, I think for the most part, you've probably, whatever capacity was left out there is probably gone at this point. You still may see occasional charters that shippers and BCOs take advantage of, extra loaders, so to speak, when ships phase in and out. But I think most of that activity seems to kind of be quieting down. And I think that's where a lot of the questions are what's coming next, right? I mean, you look at the carrier side, they obviously had an incredible second quarter, right? I mean, I think it was like 28 billion or so, which obviously was a record. And watching ship orders, they're obviously going to reinvest in their business. You've seen them put in ship orders, you've seen them purchase, new equipment and things of that nature. There's not much that can affect immediately, certainly in a few years from now. But I think it's just this growing dissatisfaction that continues to be out there around the service that's being offered and being delivered. And again, there's a whole lot of reasons for the service challenges. And then the price that's being paid. I think that, to your point, not much has changed, but the thing that has happened is the congestion in some cases has gotten worse. And service levels, believe it or not, when you look at reliability numbers, have continued to dip to the lowest we've ever seen. And unfortunately, prices continue to go up. The spot market, numbers of 20,000 and above are still out there.
Yeah, and I think it's a little hard to get your head around this whole idea of adding capacity, but there's all this terminal congestion. Like, what are you supposed to do if you put in more ships or bigger ships into some of these terminals that are already congested? I think there's obviously a need to address some of those points. Now, some of that is caused by the fact that ships have been delayed and they're showing up at the terminals at the same time, and they just can't make up for that lost time when you have two ships in the port at the same time that are supposed to have two different berthing windows, but now there's just a line that starts to form. But I think that when it comes to like this whole idea of chartering, I think it's probably worth mentioning for our listeners that may not be aware that the change with the charter market, it's not easy for the carriers either, because the cost of a charter has increased significantly. So if you go back, let's go 2 years ago, it was about $10,000 a day to charter a ship. Again, depending on size, but just as an average. And now that number has grown to $150,000 a day. And not only has the cost gone up, but the duration of these charters have increased. So charter companies are requiring those carriers to sign up for multiple years, for 2, 3 years. And that's just a very difficult thing for a company to do. Now, that is not to say that there is an abundance of capacity out there, because I don't think you've seen that. Most of what's available is on the water. But if you want to take over a charter and you want to get prioritized, that's the cost. And so I think from a carrier side, there's all types of costs they're incurring as well. I mean, you see bunker costs are starting to rise, which is also a concern for the carriers. So I can understand that, from a shipper side, you look at the performance at face value and you say, these carriers, they're not performing well. I think that's true, but I don't think it's any malice or lack of effort from a carrier. I think there are just structural things that are just causing them to perform in a way which, make it difficult for shippers to get their stuff when they want it.
Yeah, and I think shippers do understand that to a degree. It just doesn't help with the frustration, right, that's out there right now. And I think you're right. When you look LA Long Beach Port Complex, over 40, 40 plus vessels, at anchor, and the delays being, weeks, not days, that's really hard for anyone to kind of overcome, carriers alone. And again, it's not to say that the ports as well aren't doing, everything they can. To your point, as much capacity as out there is being deployed, it's just not enough. And then the unfortunate side is that a lot of the carriers have also been transparent that says, because of these congestion and delays, it takes sometimes 20 or 25% right of the capacity out of the market. So even though 100% is deployed, the congestion just starts to negate at some point.
Yeah, and this has really caused a problem, not just on the capacity side, but on an equipment supply side, because I've heard of some companies having extra loaders and just not having the equipment available to accommodate that. And that's, again, not that the carrier didn't know this was going to happen. It's just that the equipment velocity it's slowed down. So carriers do measure how many times a container gets used in a year, and their whole business model is set up on how do I increase my container velocity, because I want this used as many times. And there's free time and things which I think carriers have successfully reduced, but there's also structural things when it comes to operations. Or if you're stuck on a ship outside of Long Beach and you have 2, 3 ships stuck there, well, that's just eating up container supply, which you could use for if you could turn those containers quickly. But this is the challenge we're running into.
Yeah, and then if you look at the demand side, the latest retail sales that I saw actually dipped a little bit, but the reality is that really wasn't unforeseen. I think at some point we all knew that consumers were going to be ready to get out and travel and do something different other than purchase things for their home. But I think the reality of that is that still, if you look at North America growth, it's still significant. I think year on year sales are still up significantly coming out of the pandemic from a year ago. And so I think the demand obviously is still there, and all indications are it's going to continue to be a strong peak in holiday season. So I don't think there's anything on the demand side that shows any relief at this point. And then certainly with, unfortunately, Delta variants and other things out there, I don't know. It might actually keep people close to home again, going into fall, whether it's flu season or COVID season or what have you. But it might have that opposite effect again, where people are hunkering down, and not traveling as much. We'll obviously have to see, but at the end of the day, it still looks like demand's going to stay strong.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that you can't ignore this Delta variant impact. I think people are concerned. I think that we saw travel in the summer start to resume, but we've already seen some reduced participation in some conferences that have been out there, and company policies are changing as far as allowing visitors or allowing their employees to travel. So I think with that type of stuff happening, that points to that your ability to travel and do things that you might have been planning on might be limited. And again, this continues to then put this shift into goods, which, let's face it, I mean, this started about a year ago. And those growth rates, if you're comparing that to last year, I mean, any growth rate, if it stays at that level, is still significant. So even though the growth rates might be slowing down, if you're still growing on top of these numbers that were already high to begin with, well, I think that points to there's still strong demand out there, and points to that, from a demand side, the expectation is this is going to last for quite some time.
Yeah. So again, nothing really groundbreaking, but again, using data and facts to create some knowns where there are a lot of unknowns. And so having, said all that and known all that, obviously you're going to have shippers and carriers react to this current and projected scenario that's out there of existing kind of market conditions continue at least into kind of early next year. As you mentioned earlier, kind of this looming potential labor, issue where obviously I'm sure people are going to have proactive contingency plans to avoid any kinds of disruptions. And so that's going to lead to behaviors, right? Around how do I think differently about procuring capacity? How do I think differently about doing my RFPs? And I think conventional wisdom would say you just signed new contracts less than 6 months ago. You ride through the peak season, and then you figure out what your budget and your forecast is going to be for next year, and then you get ready to release an RFP in late January, early Feb. But I'm not sure that's going to be the course of action. What are you seeing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it makes a lot of sense to start thinking ahead, get in front of this next contracting cycle, because I think that, carriers are certainly starting to think that way. I think that you're 100% right. You have to start thinking differently. You can't approach things the same way that you might have in the past. So if you were going to have this, bid come out in February and talk about it at TPM and then finalize it, towards the end of March, I mean, maybe that'll work. But if it were me, and given this uncertainty and given the things that I'm seeing, I would try and get in front of this and at least start to sign up some business early, start to sign up some business in multi-year contracts. And you have to kind of weigh out the pros and cons of multi-year types of contracts. But I think you have to start to see what kind of position you can take early and then adjust from there. But to wait and do nothing until, first, second quarter next year, I think is a risky proposition.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I guess it's just hard for me doing this for so many years to think that it's a good idea to launch a new RFP in the middle of peak season and probably the most challenging market or carrier, leaning market that we've seen in a long, long time. For whatever reason, that doesn't make me feel good as a shipper that I'm going to get the kind of response I want. But I think you're right. I think there's probably going to be limited capacity out there to be had. And I think it's a benefit to the carriers to know exactly what customers and what cargo mix they're going to have on their ships. If they can do that early and sign deals that are, starting on January 1st, even maybe potentially at higher rates than were just signed in May. From a shipper perspective, you're going to get, maybe incremental MQC for committing early, or you might get a particular allocation to a Gulf or East Coast early for an ILW contingency before others. I can see where there could be benefits there. But again, Don, we're always really careful to say this really isn't about necessarily selling, nice checks or two-way committed agreements. But I have to say, if you're going to just do this in early and your just traditional agreements that we understand at this point from most of our members, traditional contracts are performing at 50% or less. I'm not sure you just do it the same old way and expect something to change or be different come January 1. If I'm going to do this early and I'm going to make early commitments or even sign at premium rate levels, I'm going to want some guarantees and commitments out of it.
Yeah. It makes me think of my dad always used to say, like, if you bake a cake the exact same way and you didn't like it, why do you think anything's going to be different? And it's like, hey, that's kind of a good point, right? Like, I got to make some changes. But I think there's another side of this coin, and there's some people who think, things are going to start to slow down. I mean, I think there are some companies I've talked to recently, which I think you're being fairly optimistic to say that you think things might change. And some people point to that data you mentioned is that, well, the growth rate is slowing. So maybe I think some things are going to open up. I really think that's wishful thinking. And I also think that if your value proposition is cost and you're looking for the lowest price option and you want to get back down to those $2,000 rate levels, I think it's going to be tough. I think it's going to be a long time before you see rates drop that low. I think that you look at the current market rates, even I would say anything that's being contracted now or anything on the spot market are well above some $2,000-$3,000 number. So I just don't think it's realistic or wise to try and anticipate a lower rate. And one thing we've talked about in this podcast a lot, Brian, is being a shipper of choice and partnerships and these kinds of things. And if you're hunting for the lowest price, it's it's kind of like if I'm going to buy a new TV and I'm like shopping at like all these different places and I'm just looking for coupons or the biggest sale. I'm very transactional. I'm just looking at the lowest price. I don't then have a partnership with any of those stores that I'm trying to buy from. I'm just price shopping. And that's fine if you want to do that. But I think when it comes to your supply chain, I wouldn't recommend that. I would recommend talking to your carriers and looking at, again, those things we've talked about. How do I build relationships? How do I build depth within the carrier network? Because I'm going to need their support. There's some signs in the future that look like I should have some concerns. So how can I build that partnership with a carrier to help avoid some of those potential issues that may happen?
Yeah, I think it's a hard reality, but most shippers have come to grips with the fact that $1,500 rates and $1,200 rates are probably gone and may be gone forever. And we even heard Jeremy from Clark Associates on one of our previous podcasts talk about just coming to the realization and the understanding that the market has changed and there are different variables that need to be considered if you want to be successful and you want to move freight in this market. And it doesn't mean you have to pay $20,000 for every container to get it moved, but it does mean that you have to adapt and adjust to the new reality. And as you said, there are aspects of being a customer or a shipper of choice that definitely play into that. But then there's just the reality of saying, I need to come up with what I think is a fair rate that will move cargo on a predictable and consistent basis. And then I need to protect it at all costs, whether it's in committed agreements or what have you. I need landed cost certainty so I can project that forward in a budgeting process that my organization can count on. And I'm going to pick a particular part of my business that I'm going to apply that to. It's going to be a certain percentage, or it's going to be a priority within my customer base, or something that is going to be unique. And I'm going to get a return on that investment that I make in terms of hedging risk and building diversification into my network. And so there's a lot of thought and effort that goes into it. But I think it can actually benefit the shipper, right? I mean, say you do go out early, say you're in multi-year deals or you get an early annual deal or what have you, and you do get some protection in the places where you need it most. maybe that puts you in a little bit better position as you're talking to carriers next spring, where you're maybe not quite as desperate or the need isn't as dramatic. So having a portion of your business locked up and protected, I think could make some sense as well. And then again, I think you're right. I think this spring I think it's going to be tough. I think if the carriers are successful in committing the capacity they intend to in multi-year deals or early annual deals, I can't imagine that the rates are going to be lower than what they are today. So they will have established a new rate level that they're comfortable with, that's profitable, that they intend to move cargo at for customers. And then there's going to be no reason to go below that. I mean, come spring, I don't know why, if you got an RFP, that you'd ever price anything below that. So I think if you're going to wait to the spring, you've just got to be aware that those are some of the dynamics that could be at play, and be ready for them.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. I do have a question for you though, along this thinking of multi-year. I mean, from your perspective and just based on your experience, how would you approach multi-year? How much of your business would you anticipate trying to go multi-year? Because I think there are benefits there. But if you were to just, put your shipper hat on for a minute, what do you think the right number would be in terms of multi-year versus trying to go traditional?
Yeah, I mean, I think it differs for everybody, but this idea of saying anywhere between 25%, 30%, again, depending upon the customer, maybe even up to 50%, diversified across a couple of carriers. I mean, ideally, I'd love to have a couple of layered, deals that benefit, me and my network, and also benefits the carriers and their networks. Because again, it's a jigsaw puzzle. Everybody's trying to put this puzzle together that best meets their needs. So yeah, I mean, I'm at least looking for probably a third of my business, potentially half of it, if I can get the allocations and capacity commitments I'm looking for. And then there's also this benefit in, if I know I'm a growing business and I know that growth protection is really important to me. One of the benefits of multi-year deals is typically in future years, there's protected incremental capacity in MQC. And so that, of course, is attractive to me as well. But that's probably the approach I'm taking. And a lot of shippers that I'm talking to today, that's how they're approaching it.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about the ability to grow in this type of market and how you're limited by that. But I love your answer because, I mean, I think that's part of the point, right? I can build in some of my growth. And now that I have some certainty, especially if it's a two-way committed type of solution, now I can build in, I have a better idea of my ability to grow. And then also then I can look at, okay, there's this other piece of my business that I might be able to manage through a typical contract, but I have the security because I already have this multiple year, which is somewhat of a reflection of my own ambition to grow.
Yeah, I mean, let me turn it back around on you from the carrier perspective. There's also the decision that I need to make as a shipper, and that you need to make on a carrier, that says, okay, let's agree that we're going to do something longer term and multiple year, but how many years, right? I mean, there's discussion of 2-year deals out there. There's discussion of 3-year deals. There's evergreen type deals. I mean, when you think of duration, how do you think of it, and what do you think is beneficial for carriers and shippers?
As a carrier, I love the idea of multi-year deals because this was something that, I've seen done in the past. And when I say past, I'm talking about maybe 5 years ago. I think it was really kind of limited and you didn't really feel like there was a broader adoption of this. And there's so much pain within a carrier on managing all these tenders that come in. I mean, normally the first and second quarter of a year is pretty miserable because you're just getting hundreds of tenders a month to try and process. And it's difficult, it's challenging. How do you input all these data fields, et cetera? And, just to take that out of the equation and to say, like, listen, I'm willing to commit for a longer term. I'm not going to reprice this business on annual or maybe once every 4 or 5 years. I'm going to stick with you. We're going to work together and we're going to focus more on the execution of our supply chain and how we're going to deliver results and what kinds of things can we influence. I think that's so attractive for a carrier because, again, it's almost like you're trying to solve problems with shippers, but then when you feel like, oh, your bid's coming up and I may lose this lane in the next bid cycle because of $50 or $100. I mean, it's hard to build solutions around that. But if you had the ability to lock things up for a couple years or several years with a carrier, I think that's attractive. But your question was like, what's the duration? I mean, I think it's got to be somewhere 2 to 3 years at minimum. I think to go longer is, again, kind of new for our industry, not for all industries, but new for our industry. I think there's a ton of value there because, again, that whole idea of being a partner and a shipper of choice, now you're really, demonstrating that you're not just talking about it, and you're showing a carrier that, hey, I'm in this for the long haul. I've picked you. We're going to work together, and let's build some solutions together around the execution and not sit here and fight about price all the time.
Yeah. And the great thing about whenever you have a framework over a longer period of time, to me, that then allows you to get creative and talk about ways to, again, find mutually beneficial spots in your relationship. That's where you can start talking about longer term commitments to allocations. And as a shipper, I know that I'm going to be opening up a new DC in year two, somewhere on the East Coast, and I'm going to need extra capacity in year two. Or I know that I have something new happening in my network that I want to be able to build in some guarantees to protect in the future. And so you can start having those discussions versus, to your point earlier, feeling like you're constantly, launching and releasing RFPs and trying to review results. You feel like you're just in this constant crazy cycle around just RFPs. But if you have this longer duration of time, you can start to talk about things that are more meaningful, I think, to both sides. And you brought it up earlier about, again, these potential disruption on the West Coast with labor, right? I mean, I think the reality is it's been clear from a labor perspective that, automation is just not something they're interested in discussing any further. There's been some things that have come out from the ILA on the East Coast, in Gulf around not working any kind of robotic or automated ships in the future. We've seen flare-ups in Montreal and other places. So there's certainly enough cause for concern if you're a shipper to think about proactive strategies. But do you think that if you're doing these multi-year agreements as a shipper, those are things you can start to talk about with your carrier and protecting, some of those contingencies that may or may not be out there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, again, it's by demonstrating that you're in this for the long haul and it doesn't feel, I mean, a lot of the relationships have felt transactional, honestly, because, again, we've been in this cycle for such a long time that we just go through this bidding process annually. And I know from talking to some shippers that they're like, it's not easy for them either because they spend a lot of their time going through the tender process. And as soon as the tender process is done, then they start reviewing and start thinking about the next cycle. And this is a year long thing that they go through. So I think, again, changing the type of relationship you have, really committing for the long term, is something where, again, you can start to focus on different aspects of the business. But again, more on the execution side is where I see the value coming from. And I will say that, the way I think about it is, I think early on we saw a lot of these premium products coming on that you had, your standard service, and you could go to a carrier and pay an upcharge to get some level of a booking guarantee or something along those lines. And that has been quieted a bit simply because the rates have gone up so high. I think you've turned into a market where it's like if you want the guaranteed service, you're paying this $22,000 spot rate. It's no longer this like rate that with an add-on anymore. And I think by entering in a multi-year and ideally a two-way committed contract, now you're kind of taking that business that you might have looked at as like a guarantee or something that is more predictable. And instead of trying to consume it on an ad hoc basis, you can actually plan your part of your supply chain to move in this direction. But what I love about that is now you have a predictability around how much is going to be there versus trying to just consume it on a week to week basis, which is hard to do because it's not always there. And exactly what we saw this year is it was there for a while and then it just kind of disappeared because, again, these rates shot up to such a significant level.
So we've talked about, the importance of May 1st in this industry many times, and whether we think that these contracts that are getting signed early will have any kind of bearing or significance in future years on May 1st. And the question is that cycle, going to be gone forever? Or is this really just kind of an anomaly where because of market conditions, we have some people signing early, but eventually we'll come back to kind of this May 1st cycle? Do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, my first perspective is I'm not normally good at making predictions, but I'll certainly try my best. I think you're right, though. I think May 1st is probably changed, which is incidentally my birthday. So, it is an important date. It'll continue to be an important date in my life, but maybe not from a contracting point of view. I think that what you're going to see this year is that there's going to be quite a bit of discussion, I think, towards the end of this year and in the early part of next year. And my sense is that there's going to be the ability to sign contracts or renew contracts much earlier than you have in the past. So as you look at that May 1st date, is that really going to be as relevant? I think in 2022, it's a definite no, in my view. Now, is May 1st going to be changed forever? That's a tough one. I mean, I don't know how things are going to unfold. I don't know if this changes it to more of a calendar contract cycle. I think in a lot of ways it would be easier because there's some parts of like the TP spawn trade that are on a calendar cycle versus this May to April cycle. There really is no reason to be on that cycle other than that's how it was done in the past, which is always a terrible reason to continue to do something. But in a that was always the conference environment, and where that all stemmed from is history. So I think this year it makes a ton of sense to try and do it early. And I would expect that carriers want to have that certainty around what they're committing with who. If they have any extra capacity, how do they want to plan that? Am I looking at multi-year? And then there's going to most likely be something left but towards May. But how much is that and what does that look like? That's going to be hard to predict.
Well, it's going to be fascinating to see how it unfolds, and we'll continue to provide updates, as we get them. But always, great conversation with you, Don, and look forward to future broadcasts.
Yeah, me too. I think there's a great topic and it was a great show. So to our listeners out there, thanks for listening. Don't forget, rate us, review us wherever you find our podcast, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you find your local podcast. So thanks for listening, everybody. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast network.